Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, November 14th. Can you believe that it is November 14th? We are here. And we're going to be talking about the Housing Supply Accelerator Playbook. We've got solutions, systems, partnerships. We've got a great lineup of panelists today. We're going to have a great time here over the next hour and a half. Just a couple quick technical things. If you have any questions for our panelists, just type those in the Q&A box and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. It helps me if you want a particular panelist to answer a question, just type that also in your question. You can register for all of our upcoming sessions. We have, I think, 4 or 5 more sessions at the end for the end of the year. You can register for all of those by heading to our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, which I will put in the chat. Don't forget to log your CM credits. Today's session is worth 1.5 CM credits, and you can log them by heading over to planning.org, log into your MyAPA account, and from there you can search by the title or event number, both of which can be found again on our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Also, if you head over to our website, you can subscribe to our email list. I send 1 email a month, I promise, at the top of each month. It's just 1 email, and it just gives you a list and links of all of our upcoming webinars. Listen in for those who have your CM reporting period ending. We have on-demand sessions available for you to view at your convenience and then log for CM credit. And we have all of them. We have the law, the ethics, the equity, sustainability, resilience, just everyday regular credits. So again, head over to our website and click the on-demand tab, and you can view the recordings of all of those and get those credits that you need. Don't forget to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when new sessions are available for you to register for, and a weekly reminder of what's on tap. And lastly, we record all of our sessions and we post them to our YouTube channel. So visit youtube.com/planningwebcast and we'll pop up along with our well over 500 session recordings, all available to you for free. So be sure to subscribe to our channel so that you get a notification when a new session recording has been uploaded. Okay, that's the end of my housekeeping items. Again, I'm just going to put our website link in the chat. That's where you can get all the information you need for upcoming sessions and all the links and all the things. And don't forget, type your questions in the Q&A box and we'll get to those at the end. Please don't raise your hand because I'm not going to call on you. Just type those questions in and we'll get to them, I promise. So with that, I'm going to kick things over to you, Sean, to get us started.
Okay, thank you, Christine. Hi, everyone. I'm Sean O'Neill, and I'm with Mead and Hunt. We're an engineering, planning, and construction firm based out of Wisconsin, if you're not familiar with Mead and Hunt. I'm also the past president and professional development officer for the Delaware chapter of American Planning Association. So why are we here today? It kind of starts with APA's Housing Supply Accelerator, which was a partnership with National League of Cities that I'm guessing most of you are aware of, and resulted in the Housing Supply Accelerator Playbook, which was released in the spring of 2024. Prior to the release of that playbook, during my term as chapter president of the Delaware chapter, I felt like it would be worthwhile for our state chapter to attempt to lead an effort that was state focused to develop our own housing supply accelerator. It kind of came from one of the in-person meetings I attended in September of 23, and just thought it was a great effort, but how are we actually going to get this to work on the ground? Every state is very different, has different legal standards, different in many, many ways, and local governments are as well. So we ended up pursuing that. And so we partnered with the City Managers Association of Delaware and had monthly meetings with different constituent groups throughout the state, such as the home builders, realtors, state housing authority, and planning community development directors for all 3 counties in Delaware. We only have 3 counties in Delaware, so it's a little bit easier for us to do that. But they were great discussions, and we were able to gather ideas and identify, very specific issues that apply to our state. about increasing housing supply. So, with the city managers as our partner, we tried to focus on efforts that would also be acceptable and encouraged by local governments. Um, and so we were able to release our own state-focused housing supply accelerator report in December of last year, which was very well received and appreciated, which was great for us. It got our chapter a lot more engagement and visibility than we have had in the past. And since that time, a few people from other chapters have reached out to me about lessons learned from our effort for other states to pursue similar efforts. So, two of those chapters were North Carolina and Oklahoma chapters of the APA, which are both here today as panelists. I had thought about putting this kind of a panel together to talk about the different state-focused efforts to develop housing supply accelerators or similar efforts to focus on increasing housing supply in general, which is kind of what Michigan's done. Um, so having said that, today I'm very happy to be joined by Patrick Young, who's the planning director of the city of Raleigh, North Carolina. He's going to talk about North Carolina's current effort to increase housing supply with their own housing accelerator. AJ Kirkpatrick, who is director of urban planning at ADG, to talk about Oklahoma's chapter's efforts, which ironically just kicked off yesterday. Jason Jordan joined them, and so I'm excited to hear about that because it just happened yesterday. And then Andrea Brown's also with us. We're very happy to have her. She's a longtime executive director of the Michigan chapter. Many of you probably know her. And she's going to talk about different efforts that Michigan has pursued going back to 2019 to increase housing supply in their state. So we hope you enjoy the presentation today, and it would be great to see other state-focused efforts come from this discussion today. If you have ideas or it just motivates you to go do that. Um, the format today, just briefly, is going to be we're going to hear three presentations first from our panelists, and then we're going to have a directed question to each one of them before we open up for the wider Q&A at the end. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Andrea from Michigan, who was also, by the way, on the National Housing Supply Accelerator Steering Committee for that effort. So I think she's going to speak a little bit to that as well and give you a little bit more background than I can, frankly. So, Andrea, please take it away.
Thank you. Super happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. Again, I'm Andrea Brown, Executive Director here of the Michigan chapter. We're about a 4,000 member chapter, although only about 1,000 of our members are professional planners, and we have a lot of chapter only members. And we have more capacity in some ways than other chapters do as a result of those 3,000 plus chapter only members. So as Sean said, the Housing Supply Accelerator Initiative was a partnership between the American Planning Association and the National League of Cities, although along the way they pulled in so many other partners as well, including the home builders, the realtors, the Mortgage Banking Association, recognizing that there are so many pieces to this housing supply equation that we're not only looking at planning and zoning, even though most of us on this Zoom call today probably are planners and zoners. So we met over the course of more than a year, 4 in-person meetings, a lot of collaboration outside of those meetings, and ultimately landed on what I think is a very excellent publication that is helping so many of us increase housing supply in our municipalities. The key focus areas of the playbook are collaboration and partnership, construction and development, finance, and land use and regulations. My comments today are primarily going to be in the space of land use and regulations because that is primarily where our chapter has focused its capacity. So a little bit of background about how we got into housing at our chapter. Our board of directors every couple of years identifies a policy priority, and then we spend a lot of time and energy learning about that topic. So in 2020, we identified housing as our policy priority, as did probably APA and a lot of other chapters. Housing issues really began to become acute for so many of us around that time. So what our board does, we have a board of 9 professional planners, primarily planners. But what our board does is invites other experts in to join us at our board meeting so we can discuss together what these issues are and how our disciplines interrelate. We want to know perspectives from more than just planners, and we have those folks on our board. So we spent a year and a half meeting with other organizations like state agencies, housing providers, developers, banks, CDFIs, manufactured housing, modular housing industry, fair housing centers, home builders, realtors, really the same set of people, organizations, representatives that APA did with its Housing Supply Accelerator. We also updated our housing policy. We develop a policy to align with that topic that we are focusing on. And we always use the American Planning Association's policy, if they have one, as a model for our own so that we are conforming with APA priorities, and then we adjust it for any unique circumstances in Michigan. So we did that work. We also created a housing action agenda, again, modeled on the American Planning Associations, because that is a good document. If you have not seen that, I encourage you to go to the APA website and find it, or I may dig it up when I'm done talking and put it in the chat. So again, another more precise, more focused document that we adjusted for Michigan's unique circumstances. We also created a housing legislative platform. We create a legislative platform every year, but housing was increasing so much in importance that we actually through our law committee, created a housing legislative platform that would drive our work in Lansing, which is part of the two parts that I'm going to talk about today. And then again, because we are a chapter with some capacity, that does allow us to apply for grants and work in partnership with state agencies. We work with a lot of state agencies. In this case, it's our Michigan State Housing Development Authority and our Michigan Economic Development Corporation that funded a couple of our important initiatives in this space of housing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some programmatic work that MAP has done and also the state level regulatory, well, they're not solutions yet because none of them have been adopted. So we do what every good chapter does. We're an education nonprofit membership organization. And so we spend a lot of our time creating content and resources and tools and techniques for our planners so that they can implement things at the local level that will advance whatever that policy priority is. And again, it's been housing for about the last 5 years. We held 2 housing summits in that 5-year period. We created a Housing in 4 Parts webinar series that was so well attended. That was in 2023-24. So well attended, we created a 7-part housing webinar series last year. All of these are available. I'll put a link in the chat. But just really tackling some of the most important topics that we felt that planners needed to know about. And so much of what we were doing was aligning with the same things that were bubbling up in the Housing Supply Accelerator. We devoted 4 issues of our magazine to housing topics. And again, yes, we still do a hard copy magazine primarily because 3,000 of our members are local elected and appointed officials, many of whom are seasoned, and they do like that deliverable coming to them still. So those are some of the programmatic products that we developed for our members. And then we're also working on the legislative side. And we worked very hard to establish our law committee as a technical advisor to the representative that was just starting to introduce some housing bills in Michigan, and we provided a lot of feedback to that legislator to improve those bills. Some of the other tools that we created during this housing-focused 5-year period was our zoning reform toolkit, which got the Karen B. Smith APA award, chapter award. We're very proud of that. That toolkit has 15 regulatory reforms to be done at the local level. So not state level statutory reforms, but a set of reforms that local government could implement to increase housing supply. When we were done with that, we were very curious. So that we finished in 2023. We were curious about the efficacy of that initiative. I asked one of my staffers actually to determine how many, we do hard copies and of course a link, but how many have we distributed? And it really is probably close to 1,000 of the hard copies of that zoning reform toolkit. But we were curious how our members in Michigan, did they know about the toolkit? Were they implementing any of the recommendations that were included? So we surveyed our members. We got just over 100 responses. And from those responses, we did direct interviews with about 30 municipalities, and the Zoning Reform Stories and Studies was born. Both of these publications were funded by the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, the state housing agency that recognizes the importance of housing, of course. And so the stories and studies were really revelatory in terms of helping us understand what the lay of the land was, and most importantly, what were the challenges that were being experienced by planners in Michigan to implement the reforms that were outlined in the toolkit. So those have been very useful documents to our chapter as we've moved forward. The next big project, and this one was funded in part by the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, was the Michigan Zoning Atlas. I'm sure that most of you on this call are familiar with the National Zoning Atlas. We did a pilot for the National Zoning Atlas in a tri-county area, the Grand Rapids tri-county area, immediately after the Zoning Reform Toolkit was launched. A zoning atlas was one of the next step recommendations in the zoning reform toolkit. And we worked with the National Zoning Atlas to code and map 3 counties in Southwest Michigan. What we found with that was, though, we didn't have access to the amount and type of data that we thought would be more useful for real regulatory reforms in Michigan. And so we've actually splintered off, and we are now creating our own platform, and we're reading all of the codes. We have contracts with the 3 biggest counties in Michigan, Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb. So we are just starting that, and we have other counties we're doing on a county by county basis. But what an incredible tool to help local governments really see, well, primarily how much of their land is zoned for single family use. So those are some of the programmatic things that we have done in Michigan. We've also worked in the state regulatory reform space. Representative Christian Grant in 2024 reached out to us and to our Michigan Municipal League. Our Planning Enabling Act does not have a housing element requirement in it. Representative Grant was getting ready to write and introduce a 10 bill housing package after introducing and successfully having signed by the governor into law the housing element of the master plan, which again, I think the strategy there was to really tell Michigan legislators and municipalities in Michigan that planning for housing is important. So that was her first step. And she followed that up by writing 8 or 10 more bills that would hopefully be adopted and kind of demand that housing supply be increased in local governments. That was a hard fight for us. And we kind of went out on a limb and really advocated with her and helped her craft bills that were preemptive, right? So we partner with our municipal league on a regular basis. And I think most municipal leagues in most states are not necessarily interested in preemptive reform. So 4 bills were introduced in 2024 and they all failed in lame duck. So we reconvened in early 2025, took on these 8 bills. We continue to provide technical advice to Representative Grant, and the bills have not yet been reintroduced. I spoke with her office this week, and we're expecting them to be reintroduced at the first of the year. But I think we'll see. But what we really recognize is that it takes all the things to increase housing supply. So we have a toolkit, and that's great. We have local governments that do seem to understand what is being asked of them, and a lot of the municipalities are doing the work. But many municipalities aren't. We have 1,800 units of government in Michigan, each with their own elected body, their own planning commission, their own zoning board of appeals, and their own policies, and they all also kind of don't like preemptive measures that tell them that tell them what to do. So what we're finding in Michigan is that our larger municipalities that have more capacity are Grand Rapids, Ann Arbor, Lansing, East Lansing, Detroit, Traverse City. The major metro areas have done really good zoning reforms at the local level. But it's our smaller municipalities, again, 1,800 of them in Michigan, are smaller municipalities that do struggle more because they don't have the capacity. It's hard to get legislative elected leader buy-in. Your constituents are your neighbor, your barber, your your dentist. It's just hard. Although our thinking with the preemptive bills was it might make it easier for some of the local leaders to pass those because they might give them cover. So we've been working in the legislative space and the programmatic. So enter the Housing Supply Accelerator Playbook. Again, so many of the recommendations in this playbook, again, created by planners, created by local leaders in a very collaborative effort. So of course, the things that are coming out of the Housing Supply Accelerator Playbook are going to be things that we're all doing in our chapters. So again, the four key sections are collaboration, planning, construction, finance. And again, our work has primarily focused on that land use and regulation. So this section of the playbook offers strategies in land use and regulations intended to guide communities in shaping their housing landscapes. Here are the 14 strategies that were included in the guidebook. And you probably can't see this very well, but I'm gonna take each of these strategies and very quickly go through them and line them up with the things that we have been doing at our chapter to create tools, resources, legislative frameworks for our members to help local government basically and planners in particular really move the dime on increasing housing supply in their municipalities. So the first strategy is plan for increased housing supply with data-driven insights, a clear sense of desired outcomes, and robust engagement. Whenever I read this one, I just think, yes, this is what planners do. This is what we do. We use data, we engage, we identify those goals and those outcomes. So this is an out-of-the-gate strategy that just aligns with the work that pretty much everybody on this Zoom call is doing at the local level. The second strategy, create enhanced housing elements of comp plans and housing action plans, such as housing demand, short-term housing goals, targeted areas for increased production. Again, this is what planners do. A couple of things that aligned along this strategy in Michigan were, again, that housing element of the master plan bill that was signed into law. So now we have that in our Planning Enabling Act. Most municipalities in Michigan already are planning for housing, but it created, the law creates some very specific things that municipalities need to be looking at, aligned much with the language that I just read in strategy 2. The other interesting thing that happened at the same time that the housing element of the master plan was adopted into our PEA was our Michigan State Housing Development Authority created a Housing Ready Incentive Grant Program, ultimately up to $6 million in $50,000 increments given to municipalities for planning and zoning that increases housing supply. So that was an excellent incentive-based program for local governments to really tackle plans and codes in a way that intentionally integrated increased housing supply. It was a low barrier grant. In other words, you didn't have to tell MSHDA much in order to be funded. One of my goals for our chapter is to actually get a little contract with MSHDA to evaluate the plans and codes that came out of that investment to determine if, in fact, the recommendations and policies are in fact those that we're all embracing that could move the dime on increasing the housing supply. Third strategy, initiate education, outreach, engagement campaigns. So again, most of the playbook is geared towards local government, asking local government to do these things. So what our chapter has done is and already was doing, but this just added really good fodder to the work that we were doing, more rationale, more tools, more resources, and they were all aligning with the work that we were already doing. But we did the 4-part housing in 4 parts, and then we did the pro housing webinar series, which was, we monetized it. We had almost 400 registrants for that. We ran it over 7 months, and we hit what I think are some of the most pertinent topics for planners and other local professionals and elected and appointed officials to really help them understand this universe of housing that, there's just so much that needs to be done. So we tried to cover as many of those topics as we could. Strategy 4, again, just more good planning stuff, right? Take an inventory of the zoning regulations and other land use policies to understand the housing types permissible in your city, and to locate areas that can support housing growth. So in Michigan, we have, like 87% of our land area across the state is zoned for single family. This is common throughout the United States. We all know what the challenges are with trying to create other opportunities for other types of housing, and it's really challenging for all of us. But that inventory, particularly if you can couple that with a zoning atlas / map type tool, can really begin to help us as planners tell the story to those we need to influence to make the hard but necessary changes. Next, exploring how to update zoning districts to promote housing supply, increase options, simplify regulations, in our zoning reform toolkit and in the Housing Supply Accelerator. Consistent, consolidate zoning districts, establish mixed-use districts, evaluate new or existing zoning districts that allow new residential types, and allowing flexibility for residential land use owned by faith-based or educational organizations. Now, our toolkit did not address that last one, 5.5, but we have talked to that a couple of times on our conference agenda, recognizing that it is maybe not that often used, but a real potential solution in the mix of many solutions that we all need to be advancing. Next, looking at how lot size, building form, context, and design requirements impact diversity, affordability, and equity. So looking at the highlighted items here are those that were part of the 8 to 10 bill housing package we were working on with Representative Grant, reducing or removing limits on lot size, reducing or eliminating dwelling size, maximum floor areas, right sizing parking requirements. Those were all part of that bill package, and they were also included in our zoning reform toolkit, and here they are in the Housing Supply Accelerator as well. And I put a note in this box. Like what I think we've all really come to learn in recent years is that we need all the things. We need all the things to move the dime on increasing housing supply. We need more money from the state and federal government. We need zoning reforms. We need builders and developers and realtors who are ready to step up and look at sort of a new way of doing things. But we're planners. And it takes a planner, as APA has been telling us for the last couple of years, but we do need to be brave and lead these conversations toward meaningful change at the local level, the regional level, and the state level. And it can be hard and it can be challenging, and folks don't necessarily want to listen to us. And we'll talk a little bit more about MAP's experience with preemption later, but we've had some trying times with that as a chapter. Next, looking at analyzing and updating property use regulations to legalize a broader range of housing options. Again, so much single family, but how can we incrementally add units in smaller scale ways? Accessory dwelling units, residential development in commercial areas. We're doing a lot of work with commercial corridors. And universal design, we have a grant with the Michigan State Housing Development Authority again this year in partnership with the Disability Advocates of Kent County to develop a toolkit for inclusive design. So MAP, our chapter, is doing the work on the zoning and the planning reforms. How do you fix your plans? How do you articulate your goals for inclusivity across that huge range? Everything from, seniors who are getting older, and we have a very aging population in Michigan, and not as and need the same universal design that somebody with a physical disability. So that's been a really wonderful partnership. And then our Disability Advocates of Kent County are they are developing a pattern book, which I'm going to get to in just a minute, looking at integrating housing supply into new plans and visions for downtowns and suburbs. That's really critical for a lot of our municipalities. And taking a more flexible approach to non-conforming uses. In Michigan, so many of our older municipalities that were established in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, they are sort of the centers of every county. And most of them were developed with, very, very walkable and dense neighborhoods, only to later on have a suburban style zoning code slapped over them, making it much more difficult for creating a lot of non-conforming uses in neighborhoods that already are composed primarily of vulnerable populations, at least in some of our older municipalities, our downtowns in Michigan, making it very difficult. Kalamazoo, Michigan developed pre-approved plans, pattern books, and did a non-conforming inventory and rezoned all of those properties basically back to what they once were, making it easier to develop new housing in the central districts. Streamlining processes for housing development and review and approval. We're all talking about that, looking at expanding administrative approvals, developing pattern books. Our Michigan Municipal League developed 2. Our Michigan Economic Development Corporation has a pattern book, and now we are developing one in partnership for that inclusive design project that I mentioned. So those are some of the ways that we can streamline development review, but also taking the elected bodies out, getting your planning done in advance, adjusting your codes so that you're kind of developer ready when they come in, and not requiring that elected body approval, particularly if you've done good planning in advance. Looking how to update building codes to effectively serve current and changing needs. So the 2 in yellow, using the residential code for up to 6 units in Michigan is what we were looking at in the bills that we were partnering with Representative Grant on. I think we negotiated that down to 4, but using the residential code instead of the commercial code, which is 3 and up, which can decrease the cost of housing, and then allowing the single stair construction. So both of these very commonly being advanced across the country. Michigan is not the only one doing these, and these were included in the Housing Supply Accelerator Playbook too. We had long conversations, deliberations, discussions between National League of Cities and the APA about how we can better participate in getting some of those national codes fixed and contemporized. I think what we realized during our conversations was we've never tried to insert ourselves into those conversations. And so it might be time for us to do that as well, and really influence that change at a higher level. Using regulatory and policy tools to preserve and improve existing housing options and culturally sensitive assets. Again, harkening back to the Kalamazoo approach, which did address needs in primarily Black and Brown neighborhoods, expanding housing equity. I was really struck during our awards. We do awards every year, as most chapters, I think, do. And we had 2, the Daniel Burnham Award and Advancing Diversity and Social Change, one for Grand Rapids, one for Benton Harbor. The Texas chapter reviewed, if there's any Texas, there are Texas folks on this call, populated the jury that reviewed ours. But I'm really proud of Michigan planners for really beginning to intentionally integrate more of these policy recommendations for these what is named here in 12, but what I read as these culturally sensitive assets. If you have a minute, look up these plans. Identify existing housing and areas throughout the community that are susceptible to climate hazards. I think we're all doing the work of looking where our wetlands are, floodplains. In Michigan, we have more miles of coast in our fresh lakes, Great Lakes, than any other state. California might argue with that, but they're really close. We have so much Great Lake, and we also have a lot of coastal areas, and we have a lot of building on those coasts, which can be very damaging, given the fluctuating Great Lakes levels. So those are things that we're looking at in Michigan. And then strategically coordinating subdivision regulations, engineering, development impact fees, building codes into a unified development code. Another one of our award winners this year was for a unified development code, not Ann Arbor, but a lot of municipalities in Michigan are starting to do unified development codes, which is just good for everybody, for developers, for residents, for planners, for local elected and appointed officials, just knowing how all of the regulatory mechanisms in our municipalities fit together. So that is another one of the recommendations of the Housing Supply Accelerator Toolkit. So that covers the 14 strategies that were identified in the toolkit and describes a bit about how our work here at the Michigan chapter is aligning directly with the recommendations that came out of that. I am going to stop my share now, and we'll do questions and discussion after the other speakers.
Thanks, Andrea. Good afternoon, everyone. Pat Young, Planning and Development Director for the City of Raleigh, North Carolina, but I'm here on behalf of our chapter today to talk a little bit about our work to really take the outstanding work that the National APA did in the Housing Accelerator, the great work that Delaware and Michigan have done, and really move it into the context for us here in North Carolina. So in order to undertake this work, the chapter executive committee asked me to chair a task force on housing choice is the framing that we're using. We have not yet adopted the final report from this group. We met all through 2025, but we will, it certainly follows the content and intentions of the Housing Accelerator Task Force work, specifically to identify impediments and opportunities for housing choice in our state, best practices from zoning reform efforts. In North Carolina is a Dillon rule state, kind of a strict Dillon rule state, meaning we can only do what we have direct authorization from our General Assembly to do. And so many of our communities, including the one I work for, Raleigh, have done a lot of really good work in this space, but nothing statewide. So we really wanted to look at ensuring that all of our membership had access to kind of best practices, lessons learned, and then importantly, not on the slide, is working with partners, right? Our General Assembly has been controlled by one party for almost 15 years. They have not shown a lot of support for planning issues broadly, but are interested in housing supply. And so we think there's some opportunities, right, to get engaged with them in a more proactive sense, to find areas of mutual interest. I think the best way to do that is through finding partnerships with groups like the realtors and home builders who have more relationships and engagement with the General Assembly. We can talk more about that. We certainly, most importantly, wanted to make sure our membership, we have a 1,600 member chapter, is fully engaged and supports the direction that we're taking here. I'll talk more about this in a minute, but there's still a lot of resistance, 80+% to any kind of preemption, right? And so I'll talk more about that because I think that's really relevant to kind of what we do next. But I will pause for a moment and kind of appreciate Andrea's framing around this idea that we are the ones that are working in this space every day and really need to be involved in or leading the conversation. And so that's a lot of what this effort was. And then to provide recommendations both for best practices and for our legislative committee. So I mentioned the fact that we have been not especially effective or engaged with our General Assembly since 2011, kind of on the defensive, if you will, trying to fight bills that remove local authority or that are considered to promote poor planning. But we want to use this as an opportunity to pivot and really find partnerships and areas of shared values and priorities. And so informing before our next legislative session that begins in February of next year was part of the remit. So I won't spend a lot of time on this because I think everybody on this call is aware of the scope and severity of the housing affordability crisis, the housing availability crisis in our country. Pardon me. North Carolina is one of the fastest growing states in the country. We are rated #1 for business. I think part of that is because many of our communities are still comparably affordable for workforce, whether that's white collar or blue collar workforce. That's starting to erode significantly, right? Because of the growth and change and the fact that housing supply has not kept up. We have 88 of our 100 counties are growing. There was, I think, a lot of time over the last decade or so that many people in North Carolina at least felt like, and this probably is true for any of the kind of red state folks on the call, that this was an urban problem only, right? But it's really becoming clear that this has now penetrated our rural, exurban, and suburban areas as well. So the argument that we're making, and that I think has the most resonance across the spectrum of our partner groups, is this idea that it really reduces our ability to be economically competitive and to have workforce to be able to find housing. It also contributes directly to homelessness, right? And many of you on this call will have been familiar with Greg Colburn's great book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem. Really, homelessness is a direct result of insufficient housing supply. So very consequential issue, very impactful on our communities. We did some work trying to identify what the key impediments to housing supply in North Carolina are, and it really aligns with the work that you heard about from Michigan and from the national in Delaware and the National Housing Accelerator. Namely, there are construction industry challenges, there's financing challenges, and there's political and community opposition. And then most directly germane to our work is there are land use, zoning, and permitting barriers that create friction, cost, delay, and really ultimately less housing. So we spent some time in our draft report, which I'll share with this group afterwards, identifying those. We also spent, in addition to engaging partners, we spent some time looking at case studies, right? Areas that had done some work around zoning reform or otherwise promoting housing abundance. My greatest experience is with Raleigh. What we focused on here in 2021 and 2022 was missing middle, right? Again, anybody on this call is going to be familiar. That's housing types between single family and 4 and 5 story walk-up or podium apartments. That was an area where we felt there was a lot of our pre-war neighborhoods had a lot of this as accessible housing. And really, we wanted to find ways to look at our codes where we had made most of that illegal after World War II and look at kind of reincorporating that into our neighborhoods. So this was a multi-year effort. And I think this is relevant to the statewide conversation, that it took a lot of political courage and a lot of leadership and a lot of time engaging our communities to explain why this was necessary and valuable and important to our communities long-term, fiscal viability, ability to welcome new neighbors, and to continue to thrive. And this is a list of the things that we did. Again, as a Dillon rural state, we do have authority to do many of this work, much of this work. We do not have the ability to do inclusionary zoning. We do not have a statewide enabling legislation for comprehensive planning. We do have, of course, for the zoning powers. So we really focused on the code provisions that were impeding development of missing middle type housing. And it's been really, really successful, right? So since 2021, we've had about 3,000 approved units, including accessory dwelling units, which were allowed everywhere. That's about 1/3 of the total units that were approved in our community since that time. So 33% of our housing stock would not have been permissible or allowed prior to 2021. We're really proud of that. We've seen stabilization in our rents and our housing prices, and we think there's a direct correlation. Of course, there's some macroeconomic factors as well. So taking this experience from Raleigh and then Charlotte, Asheville, Chapel Hill, others have done or begun to do some of the same work, really has informed the work we're doing on a statewide level. But the main thing we're hearing from our communities is there's a lot of difference in terms of both political appetite and perceived need for some of these tools. North Carolina, a lot like Ohio and Michigan, really most states, there's a lot of rural areas, a lot of suburban areas, a lot of urban areas. And so we polled our membership and found a high level of support for inclusionary zoning. That's, of course, not authorized and is very unlikely to be authorized. Multifamily and commercial zones, we'll return to that later, and ADUs were the two areas where there was over 80% of our membership that either supported or would likely support it based on some of the provisions. Our legislative group did a assessment that showed that there was not widespread support for preemption. And so that there's a tension there. And that really is the center of our work is, do we just promote these as best practices and as a toolkit, or do we work with our legislators to try to get them embedded in law and required statewide? So we had 105 responses, 98% of which said that housing affordability was a big concern. So again, no real disagreement or divergence on the importance. I think the disagreement and divergence is how to deal with it, right? So I mentioned the stakeholder piece. We're still working on whether the report is going to be published as an APA only report, APA and C, or whether we're going to try to have it be co-published with partner organizations, similar to what Delaware did. This is the list of tools. I won't reiterate these because they really overlap significantly with Michigan's. I don't think there's very much difference there, but we do think this is a really valuable start to begin the conversation further with our legislators. We, of course, have talked to them to some extent, but we want to make sure that we are talking with one voice and talking with partners to move the statewide work forward. To that end, so the recommendations from the task force group, we had a 34-member committee, represented all parts of the state, all types of communities. We recommended really 3 legislative recommendations: increased state support for affordable housing, whether that's direct grants or authority to do impact fees or other local interventions to ensure that low end of the market, essentially that legally binding affordable housing was is properly funded, because there's really limited funding from the state for that. We primarily rely on this federal tax credit and gap financing provided at the local level. And we also made 2 recommendations aligning with our membership feedback that would be preemption. Allow ADUs in single family zones with utilities, and to permit multifamily up to kind of a modest transit supported density in commercial zones with utilities. The task force felt like these were warranted and necessary everywhere in the state, and would have negligible or no negative impacts on our communities. As Andrew alluded to, there's a very, very big divide with our League of Municipalities that is entirely, completely, reflexively, unmovably opposed to any preemption, despite the scale and scope of the problem with housing affordability we have. So we have not taken this to our executive committee yet. That's going to go in early February. And then there'll be really a tough decision for us to make there about whether or not we want to deviate from our League of Municipalities, where most of our membership, of course, works. Part of the reason I'm able to lead on this topic is because our community, and the one I worked for previously, Durham, North Carolina, has done this work, right? But many communities, it's still a very controversial issue. So we'll see how that goes. It'll be very interesting. So we're continuing to we had our statewide conference that was in conjunction with South Carolina in last month. We're taking final feedback until tomorrow, and then we're going to finalize the report, bring it to the legislative committee to try to get on the same page with them, and then to our executive committee in February. But in conclusion, I think there was really near unanimous support that expanding housing choice, both to ensure affordability for low-income people and just to ensure economic vitality and choice, right? For folks that are retiring and downsizing, that need somewhere for their adult children to live, have options and opportunities. So really, we are excited and hopeful that our report will help add to that conversation, certainly give local governments tools, and then move the conversation forward in partnership with other organizations going forward. So with that, I'll conclude. As Andrea said, we'll take comments later. I'll turn it over to AJ Kirkpatrick with the Oklahoma chapter to talk a little bit about their work.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Yes, I'm with ADG Blatt. I'm a director of urban planning. We are primarily known for being program consultants to the city on its maps, not Andrea's maps, which is the metropolitan area projects, which has helped build a lot of quality of life projects here in Oklahoma City and is really driving the revitalization of our community. But most importantly, I am a Ohio State graduate of 2004. Got my master's in planning. So OH to all my brethren out there. I am the legislative subcommittee chair for our APA board, and kind of echoing a lot of what you've heard today. Our role was very minor. I almost kind of was put on that position because I knew I was the one that could go over to the Capitol and to OML if I needed to. We were being invited to OML meetings, and we were kind of being a fly on the wall and occasionally trying to get word out if there were some bills that seemed really concerning to us. But we really have started to see a sea change. We're starting to see a lot of younger planners, and that has really started, that they have actually wanted to, start to get more involved in legislative issues. And so this has bubbled up in part because of one of our younger planners, Micah Snyder, met Patrick and heard some of the things that Delaware is doing, and so brought this idea back to us. And so if it didn't already get said, we had our kickoff event yesterday with Jason Jordan, who is the principal for public affairs for APA. So he was in town, and we spent most of the day with him. And I'm going to kind of walk you through where we are. Bear in mind that we're much further back in the process than what you've heard. So we're just barely getting this thing off the ground and kind of trying to figure out what to do next year. Let me advance my slide here. So I wanted to give you a state by state comparison just to help drive home some of the difference. So, in this conversation we're having, we are one of the smaller states. We also are one of the more rural states. And in terms of, red states, we are one of the reddest states in the country. That 65% urban population, almost all of that is in Oklahoma City and Tulsa Metro. And we also have, a very low, I would say a lower median income than a lot of the states that we're talking about. Some of what, Patrick said earlier, our chamber has been very good, the Greater Oklahoma City Chamber and the state chamber, about talking about how business friendly we are, and that we have some of the lowest housing in the nation, depending on what you look at, that we maybe have some of the cheapest housing. So that has, I think, colored some of this conversation. And I think we'll get into that a little bit in the Q&A. So I'm kind of on my own personal journey on this topic. I'll admit that I'm kind of a latecomer to this, and it was really these younger planners that helped to kind of. I was seeing the memes about how hard it is for people in their 20s to buy houses, and I was seeing headlines, and it wasn't bubbling above that simmer in my head until they really put it in front of me. So I've been kind of doing my own research and trying to understand how these things are differing across the states. So certainly, we're seeing this is showing you the adequate supply of affordable rental housing for lowest income renters, and certainly the West in general has a larger problem than some of the other states. But like in the Great Plains, and the Great Lakes areas, we're not reaching that highest category. And our Oklahoma Policy Institute also has done some articles over the past couple of years about this on a statewide issue. So they're estimating from the National Low Income Housing Coalition 2023 GAP report that there's only about 4 homes that are affordable available for every 10 extremely low income families in Oklahoma. And I think what we're finding is that the metro areas, particularly the big, the big two, Tulsa and Oklahoma City, they're kind of already doing a lot of these things. It's not being packaged in the Housing Supply Accelerator envelope, but they're doing all the things that we're talking about today. In particular, we recently had a nonprofit started with the help of Smart Growth America and the Zero Foundation in Tulsa called Housing Forward, and they've really made this kind of their their mission. And so this is something that they've been putting out in terms of showing where we are in terms of permitted housing units versus the what we actually need. So they're estimating that we're facing a need of about 13,000 new housing units just in Tulsa over the next decade, with 4,000 that are needed immediately. And in Oklahoma City, we recently passed our housing affordability implementation plan at the beginning of the year. It's got several key points there, including that we grew by 27,000 households, which is 4 times the rate of the prior decade. Loan denial has increased to 11.5%, and we're seeing disparities across different socioeconomic groups. So they make a point of that 17.8%, so it's even higher amongst African Americans. And the city recently promoted one of their planners to become the implementation manager of this implementation plan. So, like I said, we did have our kickoff yesterday. It was pretty well attended. I think we ended up with about 55 people by the end of it. We did this in partnership with the University of Oklahoma, who provided us a location and student interns, and they worked on creating a survey and then summarize that survey. And I'm going to share some of the things that they found in that survey of everyone that registered, kind of a pre-survey. Jason Jordan was kind enough to come and speak. So he was our opening speaker, and then he hung around for a panel that I'll talk about here. And then he came back and kind of gave some reactions to what the panel said. But the idea of the panel was it was supposed to be local experts that were being impacted by affordability or trying to work on the affordability issue. And then lastly, we included outreach to all the local equivalent industries that are in that HSA playbook. And I think that was a bit of an eye opener for a lot of our younger planners. The playbook on the national level mentions the National League of Cities, the National Association of Home Builders, Mortgage Bankers Association, and that National Association of Realtors. So, we did I think, an honest effort to try to include them and make it a very diverse thing. That was one of the things that really drew these younger planners to this, is they wanted to start working, beyond the silo of planners. They wanted to work across these industries. I would say we got kind of a lukewarm reception, honestly. And I think that's partly just because people don't, in our state, we're very small. I should say we're a very small board, or a very low resource board. It's all volunteer. We don't have any staff. And so this is really starting to get into a new league of stuff for us. And I will say, though, that our board is probably the healthiest it's ever been. And so we're starting to feel like we have some additional bandwidth to take on some bigger things like this, and try to get out of that reactive mode that many have talked about today. So this is what I thought my panel was going to look like when I started. I thought I was going to have a home builder, a banker, somebody from a municipal league, and realtor. That's not how it played out. What we ended up with is we got a local land use attorney named Sean Rieger in Norman, and he has been involved in some recent bills that have come across in past years that were tied to a denial of a zoning case in Norman for a home division, home subdivision that ended up having to go to court and get overturned because the city did reject the zoning case, but they really didn't have a strong basis for doing so. And I think many of us in the state, when that happened, were like, "Oh, this was going to be really interesting to watch what happens." So it did ultimately get overturned, and they have tried to pass a few things to take a little bit of the initial versions of that a couple of years ago really took a lot of teeth out of comp planning as a whole. And so that was what really started to draw our attention to these legislative issues. The last one was much more palatable, but it still, I think it was done in such a way that our legislators didn't, I don't think they really even understood what they were voting for. But it had some key pieces that they think will help reduce some of the NIMBYism that they feel like is driving some of the decisions that they're seeing even more frequently on some of these zoning cases. Ellen Ray is a planner. She's with that housing board nonprofit I mentioned, and they're really trying to grow to a statewide presence. And so we wanted to give them a little bit of a spotlight here. Interestingly, another study session that we had recently with our legislature was Kyla Guyette she's CEO of the Workforce Oklahoma. She came and spoke about the problems that they're having in terms of recruiting workforce, especially across our state. And so we thought she brought a very different perspective than what we were hearing in a lot of these conversations. And then lastly, Shannon Ince is that new planning implementation manager for the Oklahoma City's housing implementation plan. I'm going to take you through just some quick slides that the students found, and these reiterate a lot of what you're seeing throughout the other presentations, but we asked them to identify their highest concerns for the current state of Oklahoma housing. Far and away, it was that lack of attainable housing. And then NIMBYism was a big point of discussion yesterday as well. In terms of the greatest barriers, top very relevant to planners is land use, zoning, and permitting obstacles, followed by financing challenges and construction obstacles. Also relevant to everyone on this call, I think, is who needs to be part of solving this challenge, and local governments, municipalities was top, and thankfully state legislatures was second, because that's a lot of what we were leaning towards based on what we've seen in these other states. And then last, in terms of the current status of housing supply in Oklahoma, what things are working well, and assistance was the number one thing. But we had some conversations about, even we're a fairly low resource state in terms of the assistance that we can do at the state level, and there's only so much you can do in some of these communities where density is itself its own struggle. And then the next thing was TIF and zoning policy reform. So in conclusion, I mentioned we had 55 attendees. We got our meeting next week to debrief on all this and see what people want to do next. We did kind of end the day with a discussion with those that were in attendance of what would be helpful to you in terms of what we do next, while keeping in mind that we, again, are somewhat low resourced as a state board, and we don't want to commit to producing anything too large. But some of the feedback we got was that people would like the Oklahoma version of the playbook. They felt like in the conversations they've already had about affordable housing, that it would get the attention of the electeds a lot quicker if it had Oklahoma on the cover. So that's some good feedback we're gonna take in. We also had Incremental Development Alliance in town last week. It was our statewide planning conference, and so I was able to take part in a dinner where we debated a lot of this for about 3 hours with folks from across our local industries, and IncDev is already kind of trying to pass some of these. They have decided that Oklahoma, because they're fairly strong in Northwest Arkansas, that Oklahoma is one of the states that they want to start trying to pilot some of these legislative changes on their own. And so part of what we're doing is we're trying to figure out where we can plug in and show leadership, and where is it better to take a back seat and try to boost the signal of others, and including that Housing Forward group that I mentioned, because they're already actively having a lot of the conversations that we're talking about. It's come up several times today, but the relationship with the municipal leagues has been very top of mind in what we're discussing. The municipal leagues meetings that I attend, almost the word preemption, it's almost like it's a drinking game, and it gets brought up so many times on every single bill. And so we need to go in, I think, with our eyes wide open about how this gets reflected back through the municipal league. The main thing about being in a red state, I guess I would say, is we have talked a lot about using the term deregulation so that it's reflecting well with our more rural legislators, and then trying to work with the municipal league here locally, that they understand the benefits of what we're ultimately trying to do. So I think that's it. I'm gonna hand it back to Sean for Q&A.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, AJ. And I think we got a little bit of time. I know we have a number of questions, so I will direct these questions to our three panelists, but we'll try to make it relatively quick so that we have enough time to get to everyone else's questions. So thank you to all three for volunteering to do this and giving some great presentations, and congrats on getting that kicked off yesterday, AJ. That looks really good. So the first question is going to go to Andrea. can you explain how you've had to navigate differing opinions among Michigan planners, partners, constituent groups on the topic of state preemption, which AJ, just mentioned, state preemption of local land use authority, and how have you been able to manage those conflicts?
Not well.
It's
I
a
mean,
tricky one. Yeah.
it is a tricky one. We have had a long-term, very good relationship with our Michigan Municipal League, and we still do, and with our Michigan Townships Association as well. So our league has, I don't know, 4 or 6 full-time lobbyists, and our Michigan Townships Association also has a lot, I don't know, 4 or 6 lobbyists, right? And here's me with 3% of my time as MAPS registered lobbyist. But we've always sort of counted on the lobbyists from both of those organizations, the Township Association and the League. We've just seen them as partners. I've counted on them. I've been here 20 years and I've just really counted on them for their expertise in helping me and our organization navigate, because they have so much more capacity in that space. And they have been incredibly generous, and I think really considered us a good, strong partner too, because when we can bring planners to the table to advocate for the things that we are, collectively in agreement on, it benefits everyone. So this housing issue, though, really began to kind of change the I don't know, the tenor of the relationship, I guess. And during my time on the Housing Supply Accelerator Steering Committee, like, we were not allowed to use the word preemption. And I was on a panel there once and I used the word preemption, and the look of shock, across all the rest of the participants. So what we're thinking, I think that our league was shocked and surprised when we came forward so strongly in support of these housing bills, preemptory as they were. And I will say, because we were so excited to have housing bills introduced, to have a legislator who considered this a priority and who could count on the planners to help her with the technical issues associated with those 8 or 10 bills, I don't know. We were flattered. And honestly, so we jumped right in because we have been studying housing here. You saw all the work that we've been doing in this space of housing and the tools that we're delivering to local government to take that responsibility at the local level, some of which do. But again, as I said, we're seeing far too many not. I had my law committee, the chapter law committee meeting this morning, and one of the things that we talked about were these issues or land uses of greater than local interest, right? And so normally I'm going to think about things like the alternative energy siting statute that was approved in Michigan that had some preemptive qualities to it and people didn't like it. Sand and gravel bills that come up every 4 or 5 years here in Michigan, right? But both of those, energy issue of greater than local interest. Sand and gravel has to be like locally or regionally delivered because it's so expensive to haul gravel across. So what we're beginning to learn, I think, at our chapter and beginning to kind of tease out is what are those? How can we name those issues that are land uses or interests of greater than local concern? And I would argue, and I think our law committee would argue, that housing is one of them. So what we haven't done yet necessarily is sort of frame our thoughts or talking points around that. But I think most planners who are working in the space of trying to expand housing supply through these regulatory measures at the local level, which our league is fine, right? That's not preemptive. Folks are just stepping up and doing the work. But as I said earlier, if enough people aren't stepping up to make the regulatory changes at the local level, should they be made to do so? And I guess our position really was, well, yeah, they should. And we haven't made any friends with that position. And we've made, even among our planners who are our members, they're not necessarily all in with that either. So the other thing that we're learning is, and again, this speaks directly to the findings and the recommendations in the Housing Supply Accelerator, which is these land use regulations, whether they're at the state or local level, are one of four or one of many more different solutions. And I will say, as a state planning association, we have had all of our eggs in the regulatory basket, right? So one of the things that we talked about at our law committee meeting just this morning was, well, we know we're going to get pushback if these housing bills do come forward. So we'll have to deal with that when we deal with that. But if we look at, instead of just these the preemptive qualities of all of the housing bills that are being advanced here, and we know we're going to get pushback, you know, what else can we do? And so we're looking sort of at housing supply, perhaps, right? And working. So one of the bills that was not introduced but was talked about was manufactured and modular housing, right? Which is a supply side issue. And there was a bill that was going to make it easier to build manufactured and modular housing. We think that manufactured and modular housing is a great part of the equation for increasing housing supply. And so how do we work with the manufactured and modular housing? So we haven't gone there because we've been so focused on these housing bills, but now we're going, we probably need to expand our thinking a little bit on this. I mean, if you see the writing on the wall, again, I told you how many lobbyists the two government organizations in Michigan have. We're likely to get beat, at least in a short run, right? So maybe it's a mid or a long game with preemption. Maybe we can change hearts and minds with preemption. Maybe some people, whatever group, will feel the pinch enough of a dearth of housing that they'll come around to saying, yes, maybe we need to preempt. I think it's tough coming out with 10 bills at a time, right? That's a lot of bills to introduce all at once, and maybe we could have done that incrementally. But it's a hard sell, certainly for the league members, local elected and appointed officials, and then also planners, right, who also don't necessarily want to be told what to do. But we do have access and the respect, I think, of our planners in Michigan. So that's probably where we'll start. I don't have a solution.
Yeah, it's a tough one. But I think it's something that everybody that engages on this will run into. So I think I want to make sure we have the time to get to all the open Q&A. So we're going to go ahead and skip Patrick and AJ's questions from me, and I'll just hand it over to Christine to field questions.
Great. And I've been kind of taking some questions and putting them together and mashing them up and creating new things out of them. So it'll be a lot of fun. All right. So let's lay down some foundation here about housing and the difference between, I guess, housing in general and the lack of, and then there's a different bucket, which is a whole other beast of affordable housing. So we're going to take this small section of affordable housing specifically. And this is the question that I'm basing everything off of here. And it's what proportion of the lack of affordability is attributed to the zoning and the regulatory barriers? Isn't the cost of construction really the most prohibitive issue without substantial subsidies? And even with the substantial subsidies, sometimes it still doesn't make sense. What more can we do? You know, we've been talking about the regulatory things that we can do to try to help the process along and to try to encourage more affordable housing. But what, you know, at the end of the day, when money talks and when you look at the ins and the outs, if it's too expensive to do and no one's going to make money, it's hard for it to happen. So what do we think about that? Who has some thoughts here?
Sean, I'd be happy to start.
Sure.
That's all right, or Christine. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we run into that constantly here in Raleigh, which is people see the new missing middle housing get built that was approved under the changes I mentioned, and it's not affordable. What I've tried to communicate is new housing is hardly ever affordable, but it does open up opportunities elsewhere in the city and in the region that wouldn't have been available if that new house hadn't been built. And I think what we've talked to our elected officials about, it's a really heavy lift, and we haven't made a lot of traction here, I'd love to hear feedback from others, is if you look back at the history of this country, really going back to the 17th century, 18th century, but pre-war, the only way we've really sustainably housed low-income 1- and 2-person households is through single-room occupancies, boarding houses, and mobile homes. And most of our communities have made those things illegal. So I think we either have to have a viable alternative that pencils out, to your point, or the questioner's point, or we have to make those things legal. And I think that's the next frontier here.
Yeah, I was just going to say real quick, my thoughts on this. I like talk to people about it all the time. It's the housing production side of it is going to address things that the market can address. So if you allow the market to work and address the demand in the market, which is what zoning reform is really about, you'll be able to meet the need for kind of like, more your middle income. You think like maybe 60% AMI or up or 80% AMI or up. To address the housing needs of those folks that are 80% AMI or 60% AMI or lower, you need subsidy. And so the only way to really address those needs is for more money and more subsidy. And so, my take on it is like we should we should do everything we possibly can to make sure that the housing market is meeting the demand, because we need all the resources we can possibly get for the people at the lower end, because of all the things that were mentioned, the construction costs, labor costs, everything else. It's more expensive to provide that housing than it was in the past. And frankly, Sean's opinion, we have not been funding that appropriately probably since the 70s. So it's all just kind of coming to a head now. And there are a wide variety of reasons, but I don't think it, and I don't think, to Andrea's point earlier, I don't think it's any one thing. It's kind of all the things we need to do. It's a real crisis, and I think people are coming around to it now, but I still don't think people quite understand all the dynamics and how significant this is. So yeah, we just need to do whatever we can to address the demand for market rate housing.
And I think planners get blamed a lot for the regulatory solutions that we put forward. And I think that's what we hear a lot about. But if we think about Jason Jordan's mantra, land, lumber, labor, law, right? It's the law piece. It's a little piece. The proportion, I don't know if you put that in there, if that was a direct question in the chat. I can't tell you what the proportion is, but I don't think we pay nearly enough attention excuse me, to the, excuse me again, to the land, the lumber, and the labor. The cost of land is so much, particularly in metro areas. Housing construction, materials we know have skyrocketed, and we don't have the labor in Michigan. Like, they're all in North Carolina, Patrick, right? I mean, they have fled Michigan. I cannot cite the percentage of our labor market from, construction workers, skilled trades, electricians, plumbers, just depleted supplies here in Michigan and probably in many Rust Belt municipalities. Land, lumber, labor, law, the cost, using more words than Sean, but yeah, the cost of it all has just gone up.
Christine, I think I'm gonna steal a slide from Jason real quick that I think really caught the attention of a lot of people in our audience. So can you guys see this graph here? This is something that that I wasn't even prepared for, and I think it goes with what all the panelists have said, is we're starting to face a problem on housing production across the spectrum, and that's having having a cascading effect down the line. So this is showing the median age of first-time home buyers, and you can see back in '92 that was 28, and that is now being reported at 40. And there was another stat that he shared that the average age of your second purchase is 62. So people, there's a book out that Eric Cronenberg was in town last week for our planning conference, and it's called Stuck. And so, it's resonating a lot of this, that people are getting in those houses and just not moving. I will say to the affordability, I do want to at least give Oklahoma City a pat on the back. Like we are coming up with some innovative ways to fund affordability specifically on the local level. And I think that is a lesson that we have learned of that we're often having to take on some things that were previously associated with the federal and the state level.
When you mentioned about the stuck, and it reminded me of a webinar that we had late last year. And some of the stats were just so surprising, a lot like this graph that you just showed, that a lot of seniors are staying in their homes. They're not moving, they're not downsizing. There's multi-generational considerations where, you know, kids might be living, or grandma and grandpa are living with them. And so people are staying put. And if I can, in the next like 5 minutes, I will try to find that link, because it was a very interesting webinar, just kind of about how we're evolving and treating housing and with our elderly. And it was all very interesting. Next quick question. Again, as I said, you know, money talks. And when we are trying to tell our planning story, and, you know, we're looking at our audience and trying to gear towards our audience and make it relatable, 9 times out of 10, it's going to involve money, right? So has anyone looked at density versus tax revenue versus infrastructure maintenance costs, like utilities, roads, as a reason to encourage higher density and discourage more of the single family, minimum lot size, all of that sort of thing, you know, kind of crafting a picture that in fact is better for everyone, at least even just monetarily, that it's better for everyone if we consider some of these zoning reform changes.
Sure, I'll jump in like real quick, not take too long on this. The first thing I want to say is to Andrew's point earlier, planners do not make laws. Okay, elected officials make laws. And so when people point the finger at planners, it's really just not logical, because we aren't the ones that make the laws. And secondly, to your point, this is a little bit my own opinion, but I've confirmed it with some folks, like Alex Horowitz at Pew Research. Um, I'm wondering how much of the current housing crisis has to do with the fact that we just don't have much undeveloped land left in major metro areas, and that is kind of a foundational cause of this, because our system is designed to develop undeveloped land in suburbs. I mean, it's kind of how most of it has worked for the last 80 years. And I don't know the answer to that. I've actually reached out to a couple academics to see if they'll study it, but it's possible that there's just not enough undeveloped land left where people want to live. And so we're in this kind of roadblock situation where you have to do infill development, and we've made that very difficult to do.
Yeah, I would just amen what Sean just said. We're updating our comprehensive plan from that was last done in 2009. We've grown by, you know, almost 50% since just that time. The central message we're communicating to our community and to our electeds is that one, that the only way we can grow sustainably is to have more housing opportunities in more places. Greater density contributes to lower greenhouse gas emissions per capita, transit supportiveness, and fiscal sustainability. So we've done a lot of work. If I can share my screen real quick, this is an example, you know, is showing that increases in land value, right, and how housing in those high demand areas are, you know, a lot more efficient and effective to serve. So yeah, it's a really big part of the story.
And I don't have statistics, but Charles Maroon from Strong Towns does. So I know you guys all know him, but that's been like from when he came out of the gate 15 or 20 years ago, that was the premise of everything that he was teaching and continues to teach. So if he will have numbers, data.
Yeah, I was going to say the same. Like,
Yeah.
you know, we've had Strong Towns come through. We've had Urban 3 work in several markets, and people are getting it. I think one of the big takeaways for me is hearing from some of our growing suburbs that they're out there fighting the good fight as well. They're trying to pass the ADU stuff already. They're trying to take the small singles that they can when they're up at bat. But yeah, I'll leave it there because I'm sure you got another question.
I mean, we could have a whole webinar just on ADUs and this discussion. Like, I mean, we could talk about it for days, could we not? So there actually are quite a few questions regarding ADUs, and for those that don't know, accessory dwelling units. Can we talk for a moment, this is a little niche, but it's totally a topic right now, about short-term rentals and housing availability, and where does that play a role, either positively or negatively?
I think if your intention is to allow people to continue to own their homes and age in place, then allowing short-term rentals as a source of income is a really important part of the strategy. I think there's a lot of research on this that's emerging that shows that unless you're in a very high propensity area for tourism, right? Coastal lake, which many communities are, I think it's a totally different dynamic in those places. But if you're in a community where there's a very small share of your housing stock in short-term rentals, in Raleigh, it's well below 1%. It hasn't been a problem at all. It creates opportunities and options and a viability for finance for ADUs, which can eventually become lower cost rentals.
To that kind of niche piece, can we talk about tiny homes for a moment? I know, we talked about manufactured homes. We don't call them mobile homes here in Ohio anymore because it's not a term that we use. But what about tiny homes? Those are becoming a thing now. And is that a potential solution? And are there things that we should be looking at in our codes to assist?
So I'll jump in real quick because I'm actually engaged with a group in Delaware that they don't produce tiny homes, but they produce pallet shelter villages for homeless. And I've not always been the biggest fan of tiny homes, just because I think you can build an apartment or you can build other types of housing where it's easier and you're actually producing more units with the same amount of land. But I think in terms of like a homelessness solution, there's a lot there. And there's models like the one in Delaware all around the country where you're able to really address the homelessness issue a lot more effectively with, very small homes like pallet shelters.
Yeah, I would say Oklahoma City and Tulsa have both had some success with doing those as more like PUD developments. I think you're starting to get in the question of how much of it can you do by right, but we actually have seen even some of our smaller communities that have started to adopt that. Guthrie, which is our original state capital, just unveiled something like that.
I have 2:30 on my watch. This happened fast. Folks, if you didn't get your question answered, I am going to send the questions to our panelists, so they will have the option to answer your question. And if you do have a burning question, you can always email me and I can forward it along to the appropriate panelist.
Christine, I would give a plug to have Jason Jordan come to Ohio if he hasn't already. And if there's that much demand for this, I think that would be a great thing for you guys.
Absolutely. I think it's a great idea. Absolutely.
And I'll just say for myself, if you can share my contact information, people can feel free to reach out to me, with any questions you might have.
Yep.
Same here. Thank you all very much.
Great. Again, folks, don't forget to log those CM credits. And we are recording this, so you will be able to share it with friends on our YouTube channel. Make sure you take a look at our website to register for our upcoming sessions. And that's it. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks for all the work you do. Everyone have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time.
All right, great.
Bye.
Thank you, Christine.
Thanks.